There's a number that haunts the personal finance world, whispered about in forms and spreadsheets, treated like some kind of mystical threshold that separates the serious from the pretenders. $100,000 in net worth. Not income, net worth. Assets minus debts, the actual scorecard of your financial life. Most people will never see this number in their accounts. They'll work 40 years, earn millions in total income over their lifetime, and still retire with almost nothing because money flowed through their hands like water through a broken dam. The ones who do hit it discover something strange. The number itself matters less than what had to change inside them to reach it. You're probably sitting somewhere below this threshold right now, looking at it like it's the summit of an unclimbable mountain. Maybe you're at 10,000, maybe 30, maybe you just hit 50, and you're wondering if the next 50,000 will take another decade. What nobody tells you is that 100,000 isn't just double 50,000, it's a completely different psychological territory. The changes that happen at this milestone aren't what the financial gurus talk about. They're not about compound interest curves or investment returns, though those matter. They're about how you see yourself, how other people see you, and how the entire economic system suddenly treats you differently, even though you're far from rich. Let's start with the most disorienting change. You stop feeling poor, but you don't feel rich either. You're suspended in this strange middle space where you have real money, but not enough money to stop thinking about money. It's like being fluent enough in a language to know how much you still don't know. When you had $5,000 saved, you knew exactly where you stood. You were broke, or close to it, and every financial decision was made from a position of scarcity. When you hit 20,000, you graduated to getting by. At 50,000, you achieved doing okay. But at 100,000, something shifts. You've crossed into actual accumulation, and accumulation changes the game. People with $100,000 don't act like people with $50,000, not because they're spending more, often they're spending less, but because their relationship with risk transforms. A $5,000 emergency that would have wiped out someone at 10,000 saved is now an annoyance, not a catastrophe. That psychological shift ripples through every decision. But here's what's strange. Reaching 100,000 often makes people more anxious, not less. When you had nothing to lose. Now you have something, and the fear of losing it can become paralyzing. You've worked years to build this, and the thought of a market crash or a bad decision erasing it keeps you up at night in ways that being broke never did. The first crazy thing that changes is how you think about time. Not in some abstract philosophical way, but in practical daily calculations. When you're broke, every decision is immediate. Can I afford this now? Yes or no? At 100,000, you start thinking in decades. What will this decision mean in 10 years? How does this choice compound over time? This temporal expansion is disorienting because most people aren't trained to think this way. You've spent your whole life in reactive mode, dealing with the present because the present was always urgent. Suddenly you have enough buffer that the future becomes real, not theoretical. And thinking about the future requires different mental muscles than surviving the present. You also start to notice time differently in terms of what you're trading it for. That overtime shift you used to take automatically. You now calculate whether the extra $300 is worth the time away from the things that actually matter. You have enough money that time starts to feel more valuable than money, which is a calculation broke people literally cannot afford to make. This creates a strange inversion. The more money you have, the less willing you become to trade your time for small amounts of it. You'll skip opportunities that your past self would have jumped at because the math changed. Not the financial math, the existential math. At 100,000, you've proven you can accumulate. Now the question becomes, accumulate toward what? The second crazy change is that compound interest stops being a concept and becomes a visible force. When you had $5,000 earning 5%, that was $250 a year. Nice, but not life-changing. At $100,000 earning the same 5%, that's $5,000 a year without doing anything. $5,000 a year is real money. It's a vacation, or a car repair fund, or a third of someone's rent. And you didn't work for it, your money worked for it. This is the first time most people actually feel the compound interest everyone talks about. It's no longer theoretical, it's showing up in your account every month and it's growing. But here's the psychological trap. Seeing your money make money can make you either more aggressive or more conservative, and both can be problems. Some people see those returns and think, I should take more risk to accelerate this. While others see them and think, I can't lose this, and become so conservative, they hamstring their growth. The middle path, staying the course that got you here, is harder than it sounds. What's happening is that you're transitioning from the accumulation phase to the preservation phase, but you're not wealthy enough to fully preserve yet. You need to keep accumulating, but now you have something worth preserving. This tension between growth and safety is the defining psychological battle of the 100,000 milestone. The third change is more subtle, but perhaps more significant. Your relationship with work transforms. Not that you can quit, you can't. Not at 100,000 unless you have other income sources. But the fear that powered your early career starts to fade, and fear was probably doing more work than you realize. When you're living paycheck to paycheck, every interaction with your boss carries an undercurrent of terror. You need this job because losing it means immediate crisis. You take indignities you shouldn't take. You don't negotiate for what you're worth. You swallow your opinions because rocking the boat could sink you. This isn't cowardice. It's rational risk assessment when you have no buffer. At 100,000, the calculation changes. You probably have a year's worth of expenses saved, maybe more. Losing your job would be bad, but it wouldn't be catastrophic. This shows in how you carry yourself. You're more willing to disagree, more likely to negotiate, more capable of setting boundaries. Not because you became braver, but because the stakes decreased. Your employer senses this, even if they don't consciously know your bank balance. People with options move through the world differently than people without them. The desperation is gone, replaced by something that looks like confidence but is really just reduced fear. And reduced fear often leads to better outcomes, better projects, better raises, better treatment, because you're no longer negotiating from weakness. Here's a change nobody warns you about. Your friendships start to strain in weird ways. Not because you became a different person, but because money creates distance even when you're trying to prevent it. You have $100,000 and your close friend has $3,000. And suddenly every financial conversation is loaded with unspoken tension. You can't talk about your money problems because they sound like bragging. Should I put this into a Roth or traditional retirement is a real question for you. But your friend who's worried about making rent hears it as, look, how much money I have to worry about. You're not trying to be insensitive, but the gap in financial realities creates a gap in shared experience. Some friends will resent you, subtly or overtly. Others will start treating you like a bank, asking for loans or temporary help that both of you know won't be repaid. The friendship becomes transactional in ways it wasn't before, and you're faced with choosing between your money and your relationships. Often, you lose some of both. This is one of the lonelier aspects of building wealth. You outgrow your broke friends' financial conversations, but you're nowhere near wealthy enough to relate to actually rich people's concerns. You're in the middle, and the middle is isolating. The people below you see you as having made it. The people above you see you as still struggling. Both are partially right. The fourth major change is how the financial system itself treats you. This is perhaps the most concrete, least psychological shift, but it's striking once you notice it. Banks, credit card companies, investment firms, they all suddenly want your business in ways they didn't before. Pre-approved offers start arriving with better terms. Credit limits increase without you asking. Banks offer you relationship bonuses and premium accounts. You're the same person with the same job, but now you have capital, and capital is what the system cares about. They weren't interested in you when you needed help, they're interested now that you don't. This reveals something dark about how finance works. The system is designed to help people who need help least. When you were broke and needed a loan, the terms were predatory. Now that you have money and don't need loans, you're offered attractive rates. The game is rigged, but it's rigged in your favor now, and you have to decide what to do with that knowledge. Some people at this milestone become more generous, remembering what it was like on the other side. Others become more conservative, convinced they earned this entirely through merit, and that anyone else could do the same if they just tried harder. The truth is messier, you probably worked hard, but you also got lucky in ways you don't see, and your hard work was only possible because you started from certain advantages. Let's talk about the fifth change. Your risk tolerance completely recalibrates. When you had $10,000, losing $5,000 would have been devastating. At $100,000, losing $5,000 is still painful, but it's survivable. This changes what you're willing to try. You might consider starting a business, investing in individual stocks, buying real estate, or making other moves that would have been reckless earlier. Not because you're richer. $100,000 isn't rich, but because you can afford to take a calculated risk and survive if it fails. The downside is capped in a way it wasn't before. But here's the trap. Higher risk tolerance can lead to catastrophic mistakes if you're not careful. You've just spent years learning discipline, learning to save, learning to be conservative with money. Now you need to unlearn some of that without unlearning all of it. You need to take smart risks without taking stupid ones, and telling the difference is harder than it sounds. A lot of people sabotage themselves right here. They get to 100,000 through careful, conservative saving, and then they blow half of it on some opportunity that sounded good in the moment. The loss isn't just financial, it's psychological. You proved you could build something, then you proved you could destroy it, and rebuilding after a self-inflicted loss is harder than building from zero. The sixth change is about identity, and it's the most uncomfortable one. For years, maybe decades, you were the person without money. That was part of your identity, your story, your explanation for why certain things weren't possible. At 100,000, that story doesn't work anymore. You have money. Now what? This sounds like a good problem to have, and it is. But it's still a problem. You have to construct a new identity, and that construction requires admitting that maybe some of the things you thought were impossible, because you were broke, were actually impossible, because you were afraid. The broke excuse is gone, and that's terrifying. Some people unconsciously sabotage their wealth to return to the familiar identity. They find ways to spend it down, to make bad decisions, to slide back to where they're comfortable even though they consciously want more. The known misery of being broke feels safer than the unknown territory of having resources and the responsibility that comes with them. This is why lottery winners often end up broke. It's not just that they don't know how to manage money, it's that being wealthy contradicts their identity, so they unconsciously destroy the wealth to return to the identity. At 100,000, you're not wealthy, but you're wealthy enough that the same psychological pattern can start to operate if you're not aware of it. The seventh crazy change is how you think about consumption. When you were broke, every purchase was a negotiation with yourself. Can I afford this? Do I need this? Is this worth it? At 100,000, you can afford almost anything you want day to day, but buying it would slow your progress toward larger goals. This creates a different kind of discipline. Before, you didn't buy things because you literally couldn't afford them. Now, you don't buy things because you're choosing not to, even though you could. This is much harder. Scarcity-driven restraint is easy. You have no choice. Abundance-driven restraint requires constantly choosing the long term over the short term. You'll walk through a store and see something you want, something you could easily buy without impacting your monthly budget, but buying it means that money doesn't get invested, doesn't compound, doesn't work toward the larger goal. So you don't buy it. And this choice, repeated thousands of times, is what separates people who stay at 100,000 from people who get to 1,000,000. The psychological weight of this is exhausting. You're not depriving yourself because you're broke. You're depriving yourself by choice, which means you can't blame circumstances. Every purchase becomes a referendum on your priorities, and most people aren't prepared for that level of intentionality in their daily life. Here's the eighth change, and it's darker than the others. You start to see poverty differently. When you were broke, you understood viscerally why people make the financial decisions they make. Now, with distance and security, it's easier to judge. You forget what it felt like to need immediate relief, even when long-term planning would be smarter. You find yourself thinking things like, why don't they just save? Or, they should invest instead of buying that. You forget that saving requires surplus, and surplus requires income, and income requires opportunities, and opportunities require advantages. You forget because forgetting is comfortable, and it lets you believe you earned this entirely through your own effort. This is the beginning of how people become disconnected from the reality most people live. Not intentionally cruel, just forgetful. And that forgetfulness makes them less likely to support policies or practices that would help others climb the same ladder they climbed, because they've convinced themselves the ladder doesn't exist. They flew up through pure willpower. If you can stay aware of this tendency, you can resist it. You can remember what it was like to be on the other side, and you can use your position to pull others up. But it requires active effort to maintain empathy across wealth divides, and most people don't make that effort. They drift into the comfortable belief that they deserve everything they have. The ninth change is about time horizons expanding even further. At 10,000 saved, you thought about next month. At 50,000, you thought about next year. At 100,000, you start thinking about retirement in concrete terms, even if retirement is decades away. You run calculators that project your net worth forward. If you save this much per year and earn this return, you'll have this much in 30 years. These numbers are huge. Retirement calculators show you becoming a millionaire, maybe a multimillionaire, just by continuing what you're already doing. It's the first time that conventional retirement starts to seem actually possible, but it also makes the present feel like preparation for a life you'll live later, and that's dangerous. You're 35, calculating for 65, and the 30 years between become just a waiting period. Some people reach financial goals only to realize they don't know how to enjoy the security they built. The balance is delicate. Plan for the future without sacrificing the present entirely. Invest aggressively, but not obsessively. Build wealth, but don't let building wealth become your only identity. At 100,000, you're secure enough that this balance becomes possible, but that doesn't mean it's easy. The 10th change is perhaps the strangest. You realize 100,000 isn't actually that much money. When you were at zero, 100,000 sounded like wealth beyond measure. Now that you're here, you see how far it is to actual financial independence. You'd need at least $1 million to even consider early retirement, probably more. 100,000 is a milestone, but it's not the destination. This realization is both motivating and demoralizing. Motivating because now you know the path works, you've proven you can accumulate. Demoralizing because the mountain you just climbed is revealed to be just a foothill, and the real summit is still 10 times higher. The goalposts moved, or maybe you just couldn't see them clearly from where you started. Some people give up here. They hit 100,000, realize how far they still have to go, and decide it's not worth the continued sacrifice. They plateau, spending what they earn, maintaining but not growing. This is a valid choice, but it means they'll never reach the next level where wealth starts to create genuine freedom. Others double down. They see the path clearly now, they know it works, and they commit to continuing even though it will take longer than they hoped. These are the people who end up at 500,000, then 1 million, then beyond. Not because they're smarter or more disciplined, but because they didn't quit when the full scope of the journey became visible. Let's talk about the 11th change. Your relationship with debt transforms. When you were broke, debt was this monster that controlled your life, and paying it off was the primary goal. At 100,000 net worth, you probably have little to no bad debt left, and now you start to understand good debt, leverage used intentionally to build wealth faster. You might take on a mortgage not because you have to, but because you've run the numbers and realized that borrowing at 3% to invest at 7% is mathematically sound. This is sophisticated financial thinking that was completely inaccessible when you were just trying to survive. Now it's not just accessible, it's necessary to keep progressing. But debt always carries psychological weight even when the math makes sense. You're borrowing from your future self, and there's no guarantee that future will unfold as planned. Markets crash, jobs disappear, life happens. The people who navigate this well are the ones who use leverage carefully, never extending so far that a setback becomes a catastrophe. The trap is that confidence can lead to overextension. You've built 100,000, you understand how money works now, and you start to think you figured it out. You take on more debt than is wise, or you invest in riskier assets, or you leverage yourself based on assumptions that turn out to be wrong. And confidence is useful until it becomes arrogance. The 12th change is about how you see other people's financial choices. Before, you didn't think much about how others managed money. You were too busy managing your own. At 100,000, you start noticing the waste, the short-term thinking, the self-sabotage, and it frustrates you because you know it doesn't have to be this way. You watch coworkers who earn the same salary but have nothing saved, and you want to shake them. You see family members making the same mistakes you made years ago, and your advice is ignored because they're not ready to hear it. You realize that building wealth isn't a knowledge problem. Most people know what they should do. It's a psychology problem, and psychology is much harder to fix than ignorance. This awareness makes you either more patient or more judgmental. Patient if you remember that you didn't always make good choices either, that change happens slowly, that people need to arrive at realizations on their own timeline. Judgmental if you forget how hard it was, if you attribute your success entirely to personal virtue, rather than a combination of decisions, circumstances, and luck. The choice between patience and judgment reveals a lot about character. At 100,000, you have enough distance from poverty to forget what it felt like, but you're close enough to remember if you try. Whether you try says something about who you're becoming as you build wealth. Let's address what everyone's thinking. 100,000 net worth doesn't mean you have 100,000 in the bank. It means your assets minus your debts equal 100,000. You might have 150,000 invested and 50,000 in student loans, or 80,000 in retirement accounts and 20,000 in home equity. The composition matters. What's interesting is that how you got to 100,000 predicts where you'll go from here. If you got here by paying off debt aggressively, you're probably cautious and disciplined, but maybe too conservative. If you got here by investing aggressively while carrying some debt, you understand leverage but might be too comfortable with risk. Neither approach is wrong, they're just different paths with different psychological profiles. The people who struggle after hitting 100,000 are usually the ones who got here through a windfall rather than accumulation. An inheritance, a stock option payout, an insurance settlement. They have the money, but they didn't develop the habits and psychology that come from building it slowly. So they often lose it and end up back where they started, or worse. This is why the journey to 100,000 matters more than the destination. The person you have to become to save that much is someone who can manage wealth. The person who just receives it hasn't developed those capabilities, so the money tends to evaporate. Wealth without the psychology to sustain it is temporary. Here's a change that catches people off guard. You become more boring and you're okay with it. The things that got you to 100,000, discipline, routine, delayed gratification, these aren't exciting. Your friends are taking expensive trips and posting them on social media. You're maxing out your IRA and staying home. It looks like you're missing out, but you're not. You've discovered a different kind of satisfaction. Not the spike of dopamine from a new purchase or experience, but the steady accumulation of progress toward a goal that matters. It's quieter, less shareable, invisible to people who aren't tracking their own net worth, but it's sustainable in a way that consumption never is. This doesn't mean you never spend on experiences or fun. It means you're selective, intentional, choosing what actually brings value rather than what looks impressive. The shift from external validation to internal satisfaction is one of the deepest changes that comes with building wealth, and it's one of the reasons wealthy people often confuse everyone else. From the outside, someone with 100,000 saved who drives an old car and lives modestly looks like they're struggling, but they feel wealthy in ways that someone with a new car and no savings never will. The disconnect between perception and reality is total, and it's why wealth is so often invisible. The 13th change is about legacy, even if you don't have kids. At 100,000, you start thinking about what happens to this money when you die. It's morbid, but it's practical. You need a will, maybe a trust. You need to designate beneficiaries. You're building something that will outlast you, even if it's just by a few years. This shifts how you think about wealth. It's not just yours, it's something you're stewarding temporarily, before passing it on. That perspective makes you more careful, more thoughtful, less likely to take stupid risks. You're not just affecting your future, you're affecting the future of people or causes you care about. For some people, this is when wealth building becomes about more than personal security. They realize they can create opportunities for others, fund causes they believe in, leave the world slightly better than they found it. 100,000 isn't enough to do anything massive, but it's enough to start thinking institutionally rather than just personally. Others find this responsibility overwhelming. They didn't sign up to be stewards of capital, they just wanted to feel secure. But security at this level comes with implications that reach beyond the individual, and ignoring those implications doesn't make them go away. Here's the 14th change, and it's about energy. When you were broke, so much mental and emotional energy went to managing scarcity, figuring out which bill to pay late, calculating whether you could afford groceries and gas, lying awake doing impossible math. At 100,000, that energy is freed up for other things. You can focus on your career because you're not constantly distracted by survival calculations. You can be more present with family because financial anxiety isn't eating you alive. You can learn new skills, pursue hobbies, think about what you actually want from life instead of just what you need to survive. The mental space wealth creates is more valuable than the wealth itself, but filling that space wisely is a challenge. Some people immediately fill it with new anxieties, market volatility, optimization strategies, getting to the next milestone. They trade survival stress for optimization stress, and they're not actually any better off psychologically. The space was supposed to be for living, not for worrying differently. The people who benefit most from hitting 100,000 are the ones who can actually relax into the security. Not completely, you still need to manage the money, but enough that the reduced fear translates into increased presence. That's the real wealth. Not the number, but the nervous system calm that comes from knowing you'll probably be okay. Let's talk about the final change, the one that ties everything together. At 100,000, you realize that money is a tool, not a goal. When you were broke, getting money was the goal. Now that you have some, you understand it's just a means to buy time, options, and peace of mind. The money itself is neutral, it's what it enables that matters. This realization should change what you optimize for. Not maximum net worth, but maximum well-being. Not the biggest number, but the number that supports the life you actually want to live. Some people need 5 million to feel secure. Others feel secure at 200,000. Neither is wrong, they're just different personalities with different needs. The trap is comparing your number to other people's numbers and feeling like you're failing if yours is smaller. But their internal experience, their risk tolerance, their definition of enough, these are all different from yours. The only number that matters is the one that lets you sleep at night and live the life you want to live. At 100,000, you're probably not at your personal enough number yet, but you can see it from here. You know approximately what it will take and how long it will take. That visibility is itself a form of wealth that people without any savings can't access. You know where you're going, even if you're not there yet. So here you are, either approaching 100,000 or past it, understanding now that the number is simultaneously more and less significant than you thought. More significant because of everything it unlocks psychologically and practically. Less significant because it's not the destination. It's just a milestone on a much longer journey. The question isn't really whether to pursue 100,000. If you want financial security, you don't have a choice. You need to get there eventually. The question is what kind of person you'll become in the process, and whether that person will know how to handle the security once they have it. Some people reach 100,000 and become misers, so afraid of losing it that they never enjoy it. Others reach it and become reckless, so confident in their abilities that they take risks that destroy what they built. The narrow path between these extremes requires constant calibration, constant honesty, constant awareness of your own psychology. There's more to this pattern. Wait until you see where this leads in the next video.